Hello, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to all of the people online. We trust that at this point you have found the link to the presentation. Thank you for rolling with all of the wonderful changes as we continue to color outside the lines and improvise. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. So for the folks in the room, maybe you can get that last extra sip of coffee or refreshments that you need, and we'll get Carragh set up. And hopefully, if you're online, again, there is a little bit of a mix-up between the service link and the presentation link. And so now this is the new presentation link. And if you're watching, then way to go. You did it. You answered that email and you clicked on the link, or you're on our YouTube page and found the correct link. So I think we're just about seated and ready to go. And maybe, is there any further introductions? Or I'm just going to pass the microphone to Dr. Harris, and then he'll pass it to Carragh.
Carragh has their own microphone, so.
Let's see if it's working.
Yeah,
Let's bring it up a little bit. All right, is this a good spot for it to be on the lapel?
Yeah,
cool.
I think so.
Beautiful.
All right.
Okay. Maybe a little too close. That's fine. I'm in my little cage of cords. Okay. Thanks, everyone. It's so good to be here with all of you today. And to give a little sense of what we're about to do, when I preach, I don't like to talk too much about what my actual job is, because then there wouldn't be any time to talk about God. So now I'm going to talk about the work that I do. And we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction, just to make sure everyone's starting on the same page about the current policies of the Presbyterian Church in Canada about marriage and ordination of LGBTQ people, and also about ministers to us LGBTQ people more broadly. When I give presentations, I always like to put these up. I don't expect anyone is going to be on bad behavior here, but I think it's good to demonstrate too that it's good to set the table, good to remind ourselves what we're here to talk about. And so the guidelines I tend to offer are that we understand that God created all people in God's image, and that people of all sexual orientations and gender identities are equally beloved by God. We acknowledge that 2S LGBTQI+ people are full and faithful members of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. That is already true. We use language which demonstrates care and that respects the dignity and worth of others, even if we don't agree all the time on all matters. And I'll add to that once we're in question time, questions are all good. That's my job. I'm here to answer them. If there's anything that I'm uncomfortable answering, I will tell you. And generally we'll say, we can talk about that in a one-on-one conversation. While we're doing a little get everyone on the same page, terminology that I'll be using today largely reflects 2S LGBTQI+, which stands for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex. That plus sign represents additional and more specific identities that may not be explicitly named, but we know that when we are talking about LGBTQ people, 2S LGBTQI+ people, generally those acronyms are referring to the same broad and diverse group of people. So you may hear me say things like LGBTQ or queer and trans as shorter ways of talking about this. That isn't to limit who I'm talking about, it's just for brevity. You also don't need to know what all of the terms up there mean. That's not a prerequisite to this conversation. And again, we can talk about those questions in the Q&A time if you'd like. Maybe I'm going to back up a second. The decisions I'm about to talk about largely were adopted at General Assembly, which is the national meeting of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, where ministers and lay people come together to make decisions that affect the life of the denomination. These were largely passed in 2021 as the result of conversations in some ways that we've been having since the 1980s or the 1960s, but more recently started around 2015. Those conversations initially kind of kicked off by asking, in the case of some Presbyterian congregations, to change the denomination's position on marriage and ordination of LGBTQ people. or in some cases, to reaffirm the existing positions. So we're going to start with the decisions about marriage and ordination, and then I'll explain some broader decisions that were made beyond that. It's a bit wordy, but I'm going to just literally read this off for you because it's good to make sure that we're actually hearing the words. So in 2021, General Assembly passed a motion that was initiated in 2019. It went through several years of different votes as part of the Presbyterian Church's process in changing doctrine, that the Presbyterian Church in Canada holds two parallel definitions of marriage and recognizes that faithful, Holy Spirit-filled, Christ-centered, God-honoring people can understand marriage as a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, or as a covenant relationship between two adult persons. Congregations, sessions, ruling and teaching elders are granted liberty of conscience and action on marriage. So what this means is ministers can decide that they will perform wedding services on the definition of marriage being between a man and a woman, or marriage being between two adults. So ministers have the freedom to choose there. An equally important part of that is that we have passed additional clarification as a denomination that if a minister is going to say no to a wedding on the basis of it being between, say, two men or some other configuration of same-gender relationship, we take it as best practice and policy that there would be a generous and gracious referral offered to a colleague who would do the service. Likewise, so congregations, mainly through the session, get to set marriage policies using one of those two definitions. At the same time, a decision was passed about ordination that congregations and presbyteries may call and ordain as ministers and elect and ordain as ruling elders LGBTQI persons, whether they're married or single, with the provision that liberty of conscience and action regarding participation in ordinations, inductions, and installations be granted to ministers and ruling elders. So similarly, this liberty of conscience means that there is some leeway in how this decision is applied, but generally speaking, when we're talking about liberty of conscience and action in terms of ordination, we're really talking just about participation in ordinations, inductions, and installations, and we're just talking about liberty of conscience and action applying to ministers and ruling elders. Importantly, once someone is ordained within the Presbyterian Church as a ruling or teaching elder, we understand that that person holds that office, and there's no expectation that if someone disagrees that an openly gay and partnered person is a minister, there's no provision that their colleagues could treat them as if that wasn't true. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. The other way that the clerks have said this is that since we say that we will ordain as ruling and teaching elders people who are LGBTQI, regardless of whether they're in a relationship or not, those people are welcomed and should feel welcomed, right? There's an expectation of respect there for everyone, regardless of your particular beliefs. So those are two decisions with specific application, impacting specific people. But those decisions around marriage and ordination only impact, I would say, a portion of the life of the church, right? What we do week by week, Sunday by Sunday, day by day, is so much broader than what marriages we will allow to have in our buildings and who we will allow to be ministers and ruling elders. So, like I said, these conversations have been going on for several decades in many different ways. In 1994, there was a report from the Committee on Church Doctrine about human sexuality. It touched on what they would describe homosexuality amid a bunch of other things. But one of the things that they spoke about was that while they didn't want to change the church's position at the time, which was that, you know, if you're gay, that's okay, but we expect you to be celibate about it, and that any same-sex sexual activity would be considered sinful. They didn't want to change that decision, but they knew that the church was complicit in perpetuating homophobia around people who were gay, and that was causing real harm, material harm in the lives of people, not just in the church, but outside of the church, and that the church as a whole must repent of its homophobia and hypocrisy. And remember, when I say repentance, we're not doing the scary thing, this is a process, right? This is asking ourselves, what is God's desire for us, and how do we turn ourselves around and act in accordance with the ways that we've been taught? So fast forward to about 2017, and the General Assembly hears this again, and it's brought to the General Assembly in a report saying, we've said that we need to repent of homophobia and hypocrisy. Have we actually done anything about that? Has the church generally moved on this? It's important to recognize that when we talk about the church, we're talking about it at very different levels, right? So there's the General Assembly at the highest level, all the way down to individuals in a congregation like Armour Heights. So when we're talking about the big corporate sense, there is diversity of how that would have happened within the church. There were congregations that were already openly accepting of LGBTQ people in their midst. And there were also many congregations that simply wouldn't talk about sexuality, about the experiences of LGBTQ people, all of that. And so that led to a committee that was set up to hear the experiences, both of LGBTQ people and their family members, friends, people who had been assumed to be gay in the course of their experience with the church, and then anyone else who wanted to share, talking both about harm due to homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, and hypocrisy, and also about grace received within the church despite that discrimination occurring. The result of that was a report with several stories being told, and about 23 recommendations that came to the General Assembly. We're not going to go into every single one because we don't have time. But largely they're underpinned by this theological statement that the Presbyterian Church in Canada affirms that all people, whatever their sexual orientation or gender identity, are equally beloved by God. So this underpins the reminder that as the church, we are called to care for one another, to be a community that supports one another, and that we shouldn't be barring access to roles and responsibilities and respect within our communities on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Another result of that was a confession that the church adopted in 2022, which acknowledges the harm that the church has caused and also commits us to going in a new way. And what I think is important to underpin here is that the decisions offered by that special committee, otherwise known as Rainbow Communion, these apply to the church as a whole. So where there is liberty of conscience and action around marriage and ordination specifically, there is still an expectation and a commitment from the church, and these recommendations have generally had wide support about general ministry with LGBTQ people. There is a call for all of us to participate in making the church a better, more welcoming, more responsive environment for LGBTQ people. I've missed one of the things that I did want to point out. One of the recommendations also spoke about congregations and other ministries of the church reviewing, revising, updating their policies to reflect what was called the full inclusion of all people. And so when I stepped into this role in 2020, that was prior to the passing of some of these decisions, I was asking myself the question, when we talk about inclusion, do we all mean the same thing? I encountered very frequently this assumption that full inclusion meant just the passing of the decisions around marriage and ordination. As I said, the church's life is much bigger and broader and deeper than that. So, the definition that I try to share as broadly as I can in the PCC comes from a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert named Lily Zhang, and they describe inclusion as the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders, especially underserved and marginalized populations, trust to be respectful and accountable. Inclusion is achieved through actions that explicitly counter present-day and historical inequities and meet the unique needs of all populations. The reason I like this definition is that I think more of us can agree on what we mean by trust, what we mean by respect, and what we mean by accountability. That, yes, our goal is always to create safe spaces where people feel welcome, where people feel they can contribute, where people are not afraid of intimidation, and also we're human, so we're gonna hurt each other. That's where the accountability comes in. So as a congregation, things to ask yourselves, do we know what happens when someone steps out of line or when someone is hurt within our midst? How do we respond to that? I think the response and planning for a response is just as important as trying to set up conditions in the first place where harm doesn't happen. The other thing I like about this definition is that it's not specific to gender and sexuality. This says, regardless of the identities we bring into our church, we all deserve to have our needs met, and that it's possible to do that. So what does it mean to have disagreements within a community where we are still lifting up that everyone is welcome, everyone is included, everyone should be cared for? To modify the definition a little bit, to talk about 2S LGBTQIA+ inclusion, is primarily a task that is a reflective exercise for us, and an exercise that helps us look at policies and things of that nature in more specific detail, but is not to say that this is the only thing that matters. So in that case, I would say 2S LGBTQIA+ inclusion is the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders of all genders and sexual orientations, especially 2S LGBTQIA+ people, trust to be respectful and accountable. Again, I can hear some pushback sometimes about the well, what do you mean by especially 2S LGBTQIA+ people? And the answer to that comes from various philosophies around collective liberation, right? That if the most marginalized person, if the last, finds a space at the table, finds a place of belonging, then the conditions should be set for everyone to be experiencing that. So those are the lenses I try to bring to this work for congregations. I've got just a few points here about what congregations can do, particularly what individuals in congregations can do. We could have a different conversation with the session if there's interest in that. But largely from the stories we've heard, the harm comes generally when people are making assumptions that everyone is straight, everyone identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth, and planning only for straight and cisgender people. Sometimes that looks like omitting the existence of LGBTQ people in the language of our prayers, or by saying things to children after children's story like, okay, go back to your mummies and daddies, whereas kids might have come with grandparents or other people that are important in their lives, other guardians, right? So again, we're looking at this through a lens of how it impacts queer and trans people, but also about how some of these practices impact other groups in our church that we may not be thinking of. I find it really important to find ways to be learning from Two-Spirit and LGBTQI+ people, as I said in the sermon, in ways that are done in humility, that when we're entering spaces that may not be for us, that we're doing so on the terms of that space. So what that could look like, if you are someone who is a voracious reader, the good news is lots of queer and trans people are writing books. Sometimes we even have events where we talk about those books. And so you might find events at your local library or other community centers where you can go and engage with authors about their material, whether it's talking about their experiences, talking about their theologies, any number of different things. And I often advise people that if you are a straight person entering a queer space, maybe you just go and observe. Be polite, be kind, but it's not necessarily the time to ask 101 level questions. This is different. I'm coming into your space. But what does it mean to show up and just be a witness? What does it mean to show up and listen and not have to push back on everything, but to say, I'm just here to absorb and then figure out what I think about this? Largely, that's a practice I encourage because it's what I learned when I was doing work around Indigenous rights and reconciliation. I would set myself a goal of going to Indigenous events once or twice a month and just try to absorb as much as I could. But also, when you do that, people begin to recognize you. They know who you are. They know that you're a supportive person in the community. We've already talked a little bit about accountability. So here when I talk about addressing disrespectful jokes and comments, some of this, again, just prepare yourself. Think about situations where something hurtful may come up. How do you want to respond to that, right? And we do that ideally proportionally to what the harm actually is. And we do that in relationship, right? So the way that you can challenge someone who you know well is different than how you might challenge someone you know less well or who you've had some negative experiences with in the past. The last thing up here is about considering your role and responsibilities. The good news is that none of us, again, has to do this alone. So each of us has responsibilities, each of us has things we can do, even if you don't have a formal leadership role within the congregation, right? By being a part of this space, we all have the ability to influence what the space is like and how people experience it. I think, oh yeah, one final thing and then we'll open up for questions. I want to just lift up here, many people ask what's the difference between an affirming ministry and an inclusive ministry? I think that one is a subset of the other. All affirming ministries should be inclusive, but all inclusive ministries may not have done all of the steps to become an affirming ministry, which is a term specifically understood and designated within organizations like Affirm United of the United Church of Canada. More Like Presbyterians in the United States has a similar designation. And these are typically processes that congregations will go through over the period of anywhere between a year to 2.5 years, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Involves an intentional process of education, of reviewing policies. And the three things that are up there are kind of the prerequisites, the requirements that these organizations set out, which is to have an inclusive marriage policy. In the case of the Presbyterian Church, that would be a marriage policy for a congregation on the basis that marriage is a covenant relationship between two adults. A welcome statement, so making it really clear on your website who is welcome here. Does it explicitly name LGBTQ people? I'm fairly certain that Armour Heights has something of that nature already. And then an ongoing plan for education and action, right? The work is never done because people are always evolving. We are always learning new things. There are always gonna be new needs that we encounter in our communities. So I give that to congregations to say, if you are calling yourselves affirming, do at least make sure that you've met these minimum requirements. Because people will have expectations if you're calling yourself affirming that these things are already in place. And again, you do not need to be able to guarantee that no one will ever say anything insensitive or offensive, that nothing bad will ever happen, but you do need to be able to say, we've talked about this, and we've made commitments, and people know that if they're out of line, there will be conversations about that, and there will be attempts at repair. So that's the quick nutshell of what I talk to congregations about. Are there any questions?
Carragh, thank you so much. And we will pass the mic around, and I'll pass it on to Peter in a moment because some of us will be going downstairs for a band rehearsal, but
I realized we forgot to address online questions, so I've put in the chat that questions can be addressed online. I understand that in the magic of live streaming, there is a delay, so you may get this prompt for questions much later than we do. If we don't get to your question during this time, we will be sure to forward your question to Carragh, and they will be able to answer it at that time through email or otherwise. So, and now I will pass.
thanks, Aaron. And Carragh, one of the things, and again, I'm doing this on behalf of the group here as well as for you, and I know we talked about this in preparing for today. So, Armour Heights, certainly on paper, our website, and certainly in the liturgy, the words we use, I certainly try to include not only language, but illustrations, to be sort of out there and bold in terms of who we are, what we, embrace, and so on and so forth. We do have a lot of new people who walk in every single week, and it may take time, and people don't always know. I certainly am always learning, what is considered words or statements or things I don't even think about. It's not self-conscious of what is affirming or what may not be affirming, and it's sort of a totally innocent, and so on. So some of that I just sort of lay out there because and people in this room have come fairly recently from parts of the world where there's very little space for inclusion. In fact, quite the contrary, a lot of condemnation. And so part of it is learning that not only you're in Canada, but also who we are at Armour Heights. Mm-hmm. So I just sort of say that as a statement, but whether you want to comment on that or open it up for questions.
Yeah. I don't mean to do this to make an example of you, but I also forgot to show my Q&A guidelines, which are try to make sure your question's a question. So if you were going to phrase that as a question, could you tell me what your question is?
Thank you. Yes.
I'll say why I do that. It is because, I could rant and wax poetic forever, but I want to answer the questions and answer the needs that you all actually have.
Right.
So that's the reason I say, can you keep your question a question?
Yes. Part of it was setting the stage or invitation for folks here who may want to ask a question by me sort of naming,
Yeah.
whether it's the elephant in the room or not, just the fact that this is the reality of who we are at Armour Heights.
Yeah.
Some people here may only be here a couple of weeks and still getting acclimatized. Some people are here. So
Yeah.
that's all
Yeah.
that was.
No,
It wasn't a
totally.
question. But
That's okay.
I did want to give you a chance to say anything before I turned it over to questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in a brief response to that, I think the nugget of a question I'm hearing there is, how do we decide what the limits are? How do we decide what we call out and when? And I think that a big part of that comes down to, how do you as a congregation view the concepts of harm and repair? Do you believe that harm is best countered with punishment? Or do you believe that harm is best countered by being in relationship with one another and working through challenges together? And so when disagreements arise, when people say, hey, this was too close to the bone, that wasn't okay, what then do you do about it together? And there's no one size fits all to this, but if we believe in a God of redemption, if we believe in the ways of healing, then we don't just say, no, that wasn't cool, you're out. I'm not saying that that's what Armour Heights expects, but those are some of the underlying philosophical questions I would ask back.
Okay. Janet has a question.
Thanks very much. The first part of your presentation, I learned for the first time about the liberty of conscience, and I really
Sure.
appreciated that. And then a few slides later, you talked about the 2022 confession, and I'm just not sure how those two things can both exist at the same time. If you could clarify that, please.
Yeah. It's harder for me to be the one clarifying it because that's not the position that I align with, of as someone who believes queer people should be able to get married in the church, should be able to hold positions of leadership. It's not really for me to say specifically how people square that, but I know that there are congregations that are trying. I'm aware of a congregation that, in addition to hearing from Rainbow Communion's process, they did their own internal process. They're a pretty large congregation in a city, so they had the opportunity to say to people, if you are LGBTQ and you're part of our community, we want to hear from you first. Tell us about your experiences. And then figure out what we want to do with that. So a couple of things came out of a conversation I had with the minister there. One was that they were extremely intentional about process and setting up clear containers for those conversations. So in the process of going from, we never talk about this, this is taboo, they found ways to be clear in having conversations where people could express their opinions and also talk about their own lives without the same level of fear of retribution. So one of the things that they have actually been doing since before that process is that they have a Bible study group for LGBTQ people in their church where they can gather and meet. It's not necessarily openly advertised because they want to maintain a safety in that space. Part of this, for me, reminds me of a conversation that I was privy to during a United Church of Canada webinar, where people in the chat were like, well, how do we still have non-affirming churches in our midst? Why are they still allowed to be in our denomination? And the facilitator said, I was raised in a non-affirming congregation. And in a non-affirming denomination in general, if I had had access, even as someone in a non-affirming congregation, to other affirming communities within my community, within my broader denomination, I might have come to learn things way earlier than I already had. So part of it for me is that there are going to be LGBTQ people in all kinds of communities for all kinds of reasons. And so the confession, while saying we've done harm and we want to do different, in some ways is aspirational, in some ways is a guiding set of principles. The other way I talk about the remits as, again, an openly queer person who, could have complex feelings, is that the confession was less controversial to people than the specific decisions on marriage and ordination. And similarly, in 2023, General Assembly, I think, unanimously passed additional motions brought by our friend Peter about supporting LGBTQI refugees and supporting LGBTQ people in the face of an increasing global climate of hostility. So there is a sense, even among people who can't square how they feel about what the Bible says about sex with the experiences of LGBTQ people, that people shouldn't be subject to the death penalty for it, that people should not be kicked out of their congregations for it. So I hear the confusion of how can this be? And also the answer, frankly, is it's complicated because churches are complicated and people are complicated. I've also heard some people say that they can more easily now support motions like supporting refugees now that they know that their freedom to say no to doing a wedding for a same-sex couple isn't in dispute. They're like, I don't need to square that part of it. That part is protected. But that gives me the freedom to say, I object to human rights abuses against LGBTQ people, right? They might draw different lines about whether denying a marriage is a human rights abuse. But there's more common ground there, I think, than people imagine.
So I think Harris may be going down to the rehearsal soon. So I'm now Oprah, and I have the mic. And if you have a question,
Oprah, you've changed.
It's my new identity for this morning. And a new car, yes. Well, I'll leave with a new car. So Bruce, you have a question, or anybody have a question for Carragh?
If he wasn't, or sorry, if they weren't so good at playing it all, I would have a question, but I have no questions because I feel very sorry.
All right. Okay.
For the audience at home.
So
For the audience, you can repeat it, Peter. It's better than if I do.
what's that?
You can repeat what Bruce said.
No, I was just going to say for those that might be listening online, Bruce Naismith, our organist, was reflecting that what a great job you have done, Carragh, as you've explained the polity of the church, so the policies and what inclusion means, and the journey that Armour Heights has been on for quite a while as well. So with that, Bruce feels he can leave without asking a question. But we will continue on here, so if you have a question for Carragh, happy to have you pose those questions. And Aaron, I might check with you. Are there any questions for Carragh online?
Not yet that I see.
Not yet.
I see
Okay.
a comment of great presentation, Carragh.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to say something that's not a question?
Since there are no other questions at the moment, yes, and then I will decide how to respond.
I have been ordained in the Presbyterian Church for next year 40 years. And so that wasn't what and I have walked a long journey from a time when even women ministers were not particularly accepted. Well, we were sort of accepted, but, and I have sat through many general assemblies where I have been conscious of very negative attitudes, even to the point where there was negativity about selecting a women principal for Knox College. And so all I have to say is that I really rejoice that we have got this far. It's taken us a long time to get this far. And it's been a difficult struggle because I've been part of it. I ordained a gay member of session when I wasn't really supposed to do that. And so we've got to the point now where we're still moving, but we've come a long way. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that it is important to highlight too, right? That when I talk about the church is big and made of many different parts, right? That there is no one universal Presbyterian experience of these conversations. But what I will say from growing up in a Presbyterian church is that I never necessarily heard anything negative or positive about LGBTQ people. Just wasn't talked about, which meant that I adopted a lot of what I thought Christians thought about sexuality and about gender from pop culture and from like that kind of portrayal of Christianity. And part of why I think this work is important, even for congregations that might say, we never get marriage requests, period. So why do we need to set a marriage policy? Is if you're not having clear conversations about what you believe and what you will practice, you're probably missing out on understanding how you want to exist as a community. And frankly, people just won't bring their experiences to church. And like, I have now learned as an adult about things that happened in my congregation that I wasn't aware of at the time. You know, I've heard about someone who was a few years older than me, consistently asking to become a confirmed member of the congregation. And because he was a teenager who pretty clearly was gay, the minister said no and just like avoided doing it. So even though I didn't hear that explicitly, like that was in the water, right? And in some ways, the not talking about it makes it, I'm not gonna say makes it worse, but it means that people don't have the information they need to make decisions, right? So we talk about having clear policies, whether congregations will allow same-sex weddings in their building or not, because it gives people clear information. And it takes us away from assumptions, right? Assumptions about what the community believes, assumptions about God, assumptions about people, and puts that out in the open and says, we are capable of talking through this even if we disagree. And we might come to some different fruit from that. Even if we don't change anyone's mind, we might have more clarity that lets us do our work better, right? My first General Assembly was 2017, and so it's kind of in the middle of all this. And I remember a sense of like, things being very tenuous. You didn't know who you could talk to. You didn't know if someone was gonna judge you for, you know, at the time being a young woman even, and like, do you have any authority in the church, right? So the difference I see between that General Assembly and when I go to General Assembly now, the tone of our church is very different because we've set out more clearly what is acceptable in terms of how we treat one another and what is not. And again, because some of the like big questions are at least settled enough, it gives us room to get back to doing additional work that's important for the church to do. That's not saying this work isn't important, it's just one piece of a big, big puzzle. Any questions now that I'm done waxing poetic a bit? Yeah, sure.
And that is there any pressure to go backwards right now because there's, you know, like in the water, everything's kind of going backwards?
Oh, do you mean like as a result of like political?
Yes. Like I'm like afraid to write in my resume, like the talks that I go to about like Indigenous, you know, issues and things like that. My husband was like, maybe you don't want to put that on your CV in case, you know, something later on down the line, you're going to get fired for having put that on your CV, that kind of stuff.
Sure. It's an interesting question. I don't think that I've particularly seen a lot of that within the PCC. I know that ministers are dealing with the challenge of there being more mis and disinformation floating around, right? So, you know, you're in a tricky position as a minister or an elder if someone comes up to you, and I'm gonna use a real piece of disinformation here, saying, I'm just so upset with schools these days, they're handing out hormones to children, and we've had a call at national office saying, will you support our movement for parental rights and getting gender, sexual orientation, and identity out of our schools? Because they said that schools were handing out hormone therapy. That is not true. Teachers do not prescribe medication. And generally speaking, like children, and even into certain ages of teenage years, are not given cross-sex hormones anyways, right? Like, they'll be given puberty blockers to delay the onset of physical changes that might be upsetting to those kids. But that's also not a like snap decision. You know, it takes a long time to get access to gender-affirming healthcare in our country. So there are challenges that we see because of the general political climate, but in my experience the past few years, I haven't seen anyone, really pushing or accepting a push to roll back some of these decisions we've made. I might add another thing to that about the question of, this anti-DEI push, this anti-diversity, equity, inclusion push. I think it's partly addressed by being very clear and just being very clear when we're talking about inclusion. What are we talking about, right? So some people will say, oh, diversity, equity, inclusion is discriminatory against XYZ population. That's not the purpose of it. And if we're looking at definitions that talk about meeting the unique needs of all populations, I think we can push back on some of that rhetoric a bit, but also know that it's not really in good faith anyways. And yeah, it's certainly a challenge that I think we need to be prepared to deal with.
Maybe, Carragh, I'll give you a question.
Sure.
As a member of the congregation. Do you have any suggestions, one or two of them, that you might give to those who sit in the pews on Sunday or as they go through their life out in the community? Because as Presbyterians, we value our service out in the community as well, that you think would be helpful tips for individuals. And maybe one for those who are starting out on the journey and ones that are further down the journey, to try and give you two clear questions.
I think the first one is expose yourself to different people's experiences and opinions, for sure. Seek solidarities as best as we can. So, again, I spoke a lot this morning about, God's desire for everyone to have abundant life, right? And for the world to not be a place of oppression. Many of these issues that, tie into some of that anti-DEI backlash, are overlapping, are interconnected. And so I think that we're in a time where building coalition is really important. And recognizing that coalition work is often uncomfortable because we come to that inherently with different needs, but we're coming together because there is an underlying shared need. So I say that not just as a go out and formally seek coalitions, but when you are encountering people in your day-to-day life, look for those things about their experience that you say, I experienced it differently, but yeah, I hear you. I get that, I want to help you achieve whatever liberation looks like for you, because I think that that's what liberation will also look like for me. That's one piece. My other piece of that, I guess, would be an encouragement in terms of studying the Bible and theology. If you're finding sticking points, regardless of your position, keep asking questions. Ask as many questions as you have and pursue those answers, right? It is not dangerous to ask questions. I have found a lot more comfort in reading the Bible through being taught by other queer and trans elders in the church about how do you take these texts that are really challenging, and there's plenty of them. I'm not just talking about passages that say that homosexuality is a sin. Asking the questions, and don't assume that something you've heard, even if you've heard it consistently, is necessarily the only way that people interpret it. So that's my other piece, is just be deeply curious about the Bible, and it doesn't have to be scary, it doesn't have to be boring. Give yourself room to not have all the answers, and I think really good stuff can come from that.
So two great pieces of advice. So thank you very much to be persistent and keep growing and searching. It resonates with me as an out cisgender gay male with pronouns he, him. And my experience in life will be different than yours, Carragh, and different than others within the broader 2S LGBTQI plus community. So that guidance you had around affirming ministries and being open and listening and not overtaking the place that you're first in as a white guy, which is a common challenge.
Yeah.
resonated with me to also just be in community with others and reading the Bible, learning for yourself, being aware, gaining knowledge, and then being with others resonates.
I think the piece I'll add to that might help as a question for dealing with the question of how do you build solidarities and find commonalities with people is I'm always curious about the question if we're considering a policy or if we're talking about a typical practice in church or a typical way of being in society, what are the material impacts, right? I think people can get caught up in the idea of inclusion or belonging being very ephemeral, very fluffy, very incoherent and unknowable. But what are the real impacts, right? We have concrete evidence of supposed Christian advocates in the latter half of the 20th century advocating for eroding human rights for LGBTQ people on the basis of biblical interpretation. And we know that that had very real impacts on how society interacted with LGBTQ people, on people's access to housing, on people's access to employment, on how governments have handled HIV/AIDS as a crisis before there was treatment. Our theologies are not separate from the world that we live in. And so asking questions all the time, whether it's about theology or policy, to say, what is the material impact of this? What is the fruit that it bears?
Okay, I'm coming over so that I can be seen. As an insider with my cell phone, a community member sent me a text message, and they front-loaded saying, not a question. I'll make it a question.
Great.
Just want to emphasize the use of language. People are used to hearing husband and wife, not husband and husband. When there's an appropriate opportunity, I refer to my son and their partner and husband. It's just a small step, but hopefully helpful. And I'm going to phrase this as a question. What are some helpful ways we can dress differently gendered couples or beyond heteronormative couples?
Yeah, so the PCUSA has a really good resource called Well-Chosen Words that lays it out really clearly that when we're talking about God, we want to use expansive language in terms of gender and metaphors and imagery. And when we're talking about people, we want to use inclusive language. So in general, for things like liturgies, prayers, and such, we recommend, use non-gendered pronouns, use non-gendered words like spouse. But as you're saying, sometimes that can erase, or the commentator is saying, sometimes that can erase people's particular experiences. So there's, I think, the twofold approach. And this is true of using expansive language for God as well. You can either go completely no gender, or gender inclusive, gender expansive, or you can use a variety of different examples and metaphors and terms, right? So both, I think, have their place. Both are useful, and being aware of that. As we're talking to people, this is one of the places where not making assumptions comes in. When you're talking to people and you say, oh, tell me about your, and I might make a guess and be like, tell me about your husband. How's your husband doing? And that may not be the right question because maybe you don't have a partner. Maybe you're not married to a man, right? There's all of these things that can come up. So being as open when we're asking questions of people who we don't know very well to say, tell me about the people in your life. How are they doing, right? Tell me about your family, or tell me about the people who matter to you. There's all these different ways to not be weird about it. I think people worry that inclusive language can sound clunky, and it super doesn't have to. Does that kind of address the question? Okay.
All right, so, more questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Carragh, for a very informative session. I come from a society where inclusion is still a big issue. It's a taboo. And I have multiple people here who are refugees because they decided to identify themselves as being gay or trans. I'm currently an elder in this church, and I'm blessed to be in a church that is affirming and inclusive. I'm just asking for resources. At times when I talk to people in my community, I still get the pushback that the Bible condemns, being gay, things that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, a whole city was destroyed. So coming up as an elder, do you have resources? I know you've talked about the Bible. Do you have other resources, like other meetings that can help me prepare? Like when I go out there to meet people in my community, how can I feel comfortable telling them that God tells us to love one another and not to judge? Yeah, thank you.
I think in that particular instance, like one of the things I would be looking for, and I can probably grab a couple of resources and like send them to you later or send them through Aaron or something, I would be looking at the work of womanist scholars, so Black feminist theologians who are out, open. Not all of them are gay, like you'll get some good stuff from people who are straight as well, but like people like Pamela Lightsey, Emily Towns. Some of these people have been doing the work for a long time, and another book that's been really instrumental for me. Would you like your Slinky? Ooh, sorry. One of the books that's been instrumental to me is by Angela N. Parker, and she doesn't particularly speak to like homophobia stuff, but her book is called If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? And it's on biblical authority and Black Lives Matter. And it's her partly doing some memoir stuff talking about how, as an academic, she learned in seminary about how to read the Bible like a white man. And that for her led to a stifled sense of her connection to the divine, her ability to read the Bible, and how she has broken out of that. She talks about this, I think it's a Ghanaian like philosophy of Sankofa, that like it's okay to go back for that which you've forgotten. So that book's really useful. It's also very short, like it's a really approachable text. And so it's not gonna address like this stuff directly, but is a good like underlying primer. Another one I've picked up recently that I haven't had a chance to read yet is called Doing Theological Double Dutch, which is this idea, and I'm forgetting the author's name, but of like, how do you hold the like, how do I read a Bible like a straight white man, with the more playful energy of womanist scholars that says, there are questions to be asking, there is work to be done. I don't have to read this the way I've been taught to read it. I can go bigger and broader and deeper than that. So I think that would be part of it, is reading some of those texts to give you the underlying tools. And then, I mean, there's basic resources like Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian is seen as like a pretty approachable like 101 text, and kind of the counterpart to that is, I think it's called Transforming by Austin Hartke. But there are any number of blog posts out there that are like, here's how we deal with the clobber passages. But more broadly, I think getting people to look at the broader story. Sure. Sorry? Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Or I'll put up my contact. You could also send me a note, and I'll send you all of this in an email. Yeah, but it's a good question, right? That like, my other thing that I would offer to you, and I know this from experience with a family member of my own, not just about this topic, but other things, is like giving myself the peace and the freedom to say, this conversation is not our only conversation. I don't have to resolve this today. This can be an ongoing approach. And some of the things I've attended recently, in part about misinformation, disinformation, and part about like rising like hostile sentiments around like xenophobia and such, will say it's okay to like ask lots of questions of your own in return. Like, how did you come to believe that? Well, you know, you say because the Bible says. What? Who taught you that, right? Or like try to get a little deeper. Where is the concern coming from? If you can, find those places where your concerns meet. You know, say, I also care about being faithful to God. Clearly, you care. You're an elder in this church, right? This is something that's important to you. And it's okay to stand in your own authority there to say, I care about this and I see it differently. Like, do you want to continue having this conversation? We can, but maybe not today, right? Like, let's look at something that we both want to dig into more, go away and do that work, and then come back and like, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Carragh, the other thing that came to mind is the study guide that Emily Bissett authored, that's about a decade old now. at the time, and it actually was designed as a study guide for congregations and sessions, but it provokes questions such as, where does your belief about what's in the Bible come from? And has your belief changed over time? As a way to say, okay, you think the Sodom and Gomorrah story is about this, but in fact, here are different ways in which people have experienced the Sodom and Gomorrah story and what it means to them in their life, and therefore, is there just one way to understand it? Or what's the big golden nugget about that story, as an example? But you raised that. And so
totally.
So the study guide, I think, is also...
Yeah, Body, Mind, and Soul is definitely a good place to go for some of that introductory material as well. I haven't read it super recently, and I won't say this 100% holds up as the best thing, but a lot of the scholarship about things like the clever passages has not changed dramatically in the past 40 years.
Right.
Like, people have been talking about this stuff for decades and decades and have reached, the same kinds of conclusions. And by the same kinds of conclusions, I mean, some people still read it in one way, and there's a whole, collection of theologians, academics, and lay people who read it differently.
Yeah. The only other thing I might add into your question, and I use this often in my coaching, is I will say to somebody, do you think you could change your frame of mind about this topic today? And then just go quiet, because what you're doing is you're exploring with them whether they're even prepared to understand something different. Because if they're not, then it goes back to what you were saying. You have a conversation, but it may be part of a journey. And if it's not today, then maybe it's tomorrow or a week from now.
Yeah.
So anyway, any other questions, Erin?
Not online.
Not online. Any other questions in the room? Okay.
Do one last thing.
All right. Well, let's do one last thing. Maybe it's the second last thing, but
Maybe it's the second last thing. Well, I'm not giving an official thank you, but I need my special assistant, Rachel. We want to give you one of our very new Pride merch. Oh, we're going to give it to Carragh. Yes.
Thank
so
you.
Carragh can bring this message wherever Carragh goes, and it says God's love includes everyone. And we also want to offer you a shirt, but we thought we would let you choose which one you like the most. Functionally also, and
that's very thoughtful.
We're just so grateful. And did you want to close it out? Yes. Okay.
So I guess, Carragh, on behalf of the congregation of Armour Heights, but then I'm also going to extend it on behalf of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and serving God's church. Thank you for your service as the program coordinator of Sexuality and Inclusion. I will share that my 6 years on Assembly Council is coming to a close next week or 2 weeks from now. But I have witnessed the changes that you've made, the help you've provided to the church in working through the topics that you've talked about today. And I would agree that where the church is today is different than where it was. My first General Assembly was 2018, so it was a year after your General Assembly in 2017. And we're in a vastly different place. And we're moving, there is movement forward. But your presentation today captured all of that well and then offered some good ideas for this congregation as we continue on our journey of inclusion. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Well, to have the last word, thank you for having me. And, I appreciate the kind words, Peter. Again, none of this is possible alone, and I, stand on the shoulders of people who have been doing this work for a long, long time. Who've been incredibly influential, both within and outside the Presbyterian Church for me. It's an honor to do this work, and I'm always glad to get to meet people and chat about this stuff. Thanks. And I'm going to trip it off.
Thanks for watching and for joining us.
And I'll be at Camp Getty during the Pride Parade this year, so I'll bring my shirt and wear it there.